Good evening. Welcome. My name is Pat Kowitzel, and I am the buyer and author program coordinator at Magic City Books. And I want to welcome you tonight to our very special author program featuring Raymond Antrobus and the American release of his collection, The Perseverance. We are really excited to be welcoming Raymond tonight as National Poetry Month is kind of underway now in April. At Magic City Books, we're big fans of poetry, and we really enjoy Raymond's collection, and think that you will as well. We are also the home bookstore for the United States Poet Laureate Joy Harjo, and so we really appreciate all the things that Joy does for us. Joy has a number of great collections. If you haven't explored her poetry before, I certainly invite you to do so. And then there's a new anthology that's coming out at the end of the month or actually at the beginning of May. We're going to be doing an event with Joy. You can go to magiccitybooks.com and see more information about that. But that event is scheduled for May 26th. So just 3 weeks from now, just come back to this same time and same channel and join us for a little bit more poetry. If this is the first time that you're joining us, welcome. We do these programs a couple times a week, almost always on Mondays and Thursdays, often other days of the week as well, usually at 7 p.m. Central Time, and talk to authors, have them in conversation with other authors. And we're really excited tonight that Raymond is going to be in conversation with the fellow poet Meg Day. We are going to kind of kick things off with a reading, and Raymond's going to start that way, and then he and Meg will be in conversation. And the two of them will talk for a while and take your questions as well. If you have questions for Raymond or Meg, please post them in the Q&A tonight. If you're joining us over on Facebook, I want to encourage you to stay there if you're comfortable, but we also do have the closed captioning turned on the Zoom event, and we're going to be posting the Zoom ID inside of Facebook. So if you'd like to join us and be able to see the closed captioning, I think Zoom is going to be the best way to be able to do that. Emily is interpreting this event. She is our ASL interpreter tonight, and so she'll be here in the screen as well all night long. So I want to thank Emily for joining us tonight as well. We are just thrilled to welcome Raymond Antrobus. He is kind of a recent Oklahoman, now living a little bit away from us in Tulsa, but here in Oklahoma. He is his collection, The Perseverance, won many awards, and he has a new collection that's going to be coming out later this year, released simultaneously in the UK and in the United States. And so we're really, this is going to be a big year, we think, for Raymond and a lot of people joining us. Tin House is a outstanding publisher, and that's where his books are being released, and they're really putting out a lot of excellent stuff. And so I encourage you to look at all the Tin House stuff. But we're going to kick off with a reading and then a conversation between Raymond and Meg. So without any further ado, Raymond Antrobus.
Right. Wow. Thank you so much for that introduction, Pat. Thank you, Magic City Books. Thank you, Emily, for providing ASL access to today's reading. My name is Raymond Antrobus. As has been said, I'm a poet. I'm originally from London. Recently moved to Oklahoma City, and this is my first full-length book of poems called The Perseverance. And what I will do is, if you have the book, I'll tell you the book, the page number that each poem is on. So if you want to also read along like some kind of sermon or mass, then we can also do that. I am the grandson of a preacher, so that I can fairly safely kind of claim that. So I'm going to begin at the beginning of this book, which is a sequence poem called Echo. And the way in which I came to write this poem was losing my dad about 5 years ago now, 5 or 6 years, and we were pretty close before he passed, and I found myself having to remove myself from London or from any landscape which was familiar to me, and I needed to go on a trip on my own to somewhere I'd never been. And I ended up in Barcelona, and I went to Gaudi's Cathedral in Barcelona, and I end up taking the audio guide. And if you take the audio guide there, it's fairly accessible because they give you really powerful headphones, and I could even connect it to Bluetooth through my hearing aids. And what the audio guide tells you is about the different ways or the different histories behind each kind of construction of the cathedral. And there's a certain part where you're asked to stand and look up into this small kind of unorthodox shaped roof and shout into the space and sing and just be vigilant of how the sound moves, because Gaudi designed it so it would be a holy container of sound. And I'd had that kind of experience artificially through hearing aids, and I was wondering, are deaf people included in this idea of elevated sound? Do we get to experience sound like angels do? And so that set off a kind of question which runs throughout the book, The Perseverance. So I'll begin there. Echo. My ear amps whistle as if singing to echo, goddess of noise, the raveled knot of tongues, of blaring birds, consonant crumbs, of dull doorbells, sounds swamped in my misty hearing aid tubes. Gaudi believed in holy sound and built a cathedral to contain it, pulling hearing men from their knees as though deafness was a kind of atheism. Who would turn down God? Even though I have not heard the golden decibel of angels, I have been living in a noiseless palace where the doorbell is pulsating light, and I am able to answer. What? A word that keeps looking in mirrors in love with its own volume. What? I am a one-word question, a one-man patience test. What language would we speak without ears? What is paradise, a world where I hear everything? What? How will my brain know what to hold if it has too many arms? The day I clear out my dead father's flat, I throw away boxes of molding LPs, Garvey, Malcolm X, Mandela speeches on vinyl. I find a TDK cassette tape on the shelf. The smudged green label reads Raymond speaking. I play the tape in his vintage cassette player and hear my 2-year-old voice chanting my name, Antrop, and Dad's laughter crackling in the background, not knowing I couldn't hear the word bus and wouldn't until I got my hearing aids. Now I sit here listening to the space of deafness. Antrop, Antrop, Antrop. And if you don't catch nothing, then something wrong with your ears. They've been tuned to the wrong frequency. So maybe I belong to the universe underwater, where all songs are smeared wailings for Salacia, goddess of salt water, healer of infected ears, which is what the doctor thought I had, since deafness did not run in the family but came from nowhere. So they syringed olive oil and salt water, and we all waited to see what would come out. And no one knew what I was missing, until a doctor gave me a handful of Lego and said to put a brick on the table every time I heard a sound. After the test, I still held enough bricks in my hand to build a house and call it my sanctuary. Call it the reason I sat in saintly silence during my grandfather's sermons, where he preached the good news I only heard as Babylon's babbling echoes. So that's the opening of The Perseverance. The next poem I'm going to read is the title poem, The Perseverance. And when you read poetry collections and you come across the title poem, that's, for me as a reader, that's usually like a call to be extra vigilant. Like, why is this the title poem? What are all the threads in the entire book that are kind of clued into this one poem? So one of those reasons why the book is called The Perseverance is it's actually an honoring of the pub that my dad used to drink at, and it was called The Perseverance. And I lived in a part of, it's one of the poorest parts of London when I grew up. And over the last decade, it's become one of the heaviest gentrified parts of London. And if you go to the street that the Perseverance is on, that entire row of streets are almost all new shops, and the only pub that has managed to, or the only establishment that has managed to survive that gentrification is the Perseverance. So even in that kind of, I don't know if you want to call it irony or like coincidence, I like to think of it as a kind of, you know, the sign, the Perseverance is kind of like a frozen piece of poetry as part of the landscape that's managed to persevere despite all the changes of the area. And when I lost my dad, I found myself thinking back to how much time I'd spent outside this pub because I was too young to go in. So my dad would go in and he would drink. And at the time he was an alcoholic who was struggling with that. And so I remember how many memories I had of like one version, i.e. the sober version of my dad entering the pub, and then the drunk version of my dad coming out, and the kind of like, there were like two different people. And I root some of my own kind of social anxiety to that memory. What else to say? The opening of the poem is a line from my dad's favorite singer, one of the Wailers, Peter Tosh, in which he says, "Love is the man overstanding." And to overstand something is a Jamaican colloquium, a way of saying, I'm beyond understanding. I don't understand, I overstand. So the Perseverance. Love is the man overstanding. Peter Tosh. I wait outside the Perseverance. Just popping in here a minute, I'd heard him say it many times before, like all kids with a drinking father, watching him disappear into smoke and laughter. There is no such thing as too much laughter, my father says, drinking in the Perseverance until everything disappears. I'm outside, counting minutes, waiting for the man, my father, to finish his shot and take me home before it gets dark. We have been here before. No such thing as too much laughter, unless to my mother without my father, working weekends while the Perseverance spits him out for a minute. He gives me 50p to make me disappear. 50p in my hand, I disappear like a coin in a parking meter before the time runs out. How many minutes will I lose listening to the laughter spilling from the Perseverance while strangers ask, where is your father? I stare at the doors and say, my father is working. Strangers who don't disappear, but hug me for my Perseverance. Dad said, this will be the last time before. While the TV spilled canned laughter, us on the sofa in this council flat, knowing any minute the yams will boil, any minute I will eat again with my father, who cooks and serves laughter, good as any Jamaican who disappeared from the island I tasted before, overstanding our heat and Perseverance. I still hear popping in for a minute, see him disappear. We lose our fathers before we know it, and I am still outside the Perseverance, listening for the laughter. Cool. The next poem I'm going to read is called Two Guns in the Sky for Daniel Harris. And I wrote this poem not too long after the incident with Daniel Harris had happened. And I was in New York at the time, and I'd seen a very small article, I think it was on the CNN website, it was like about 300 words long article about what happened to Daniel Harris. And I just thought that was just too small a space for such a significant story to take up. So, you know, it's another case of kind of taking something from a newspaper and turning it into a poem. I think, who was it? Was it T.S. Eliot who said that something like journalism isn't poetry, but people are dying every day for the lack of what's found there. Anyway, I went to a deaf school in London, and when I was, I started learning BSL when I was around 11 years old, and the difference between BSL and ASL is complete. I can't even do the alphabet in ASL yet. So I try to pick up little bits of ASL while I'm on this side of the ocean. On that particular day, I read about Daniel Harris. The sign I learned was alive. And I take some kind of, I suppose you could call it poetic license with the signing of alive. Some people had said to me that I'd signed it wrong, and I tried to say, well, I intentionally bring the hand shape higher towards the face, so it leaves the body as a kind of poetic, I don't know, decision or move. So just to say that. 2 guns in the sky for Daniel Harris. When Daniel Harris stepped out of his car, the police officer was waiting, gun raised. I used the past tense, so this is irrelevant in Daniel's language, which is sign. Sign has no future or past tense. It is a present language. You are never more present than when a gun is pointed at you. What language says this if not sign? But the police officer saw hands waving in the air, fired, and Daniel dropped his hands, his chest bleeding out into the concrete meters from his home. And I'm in New York coffee house reading this news on my phone when a black policewoman walks in, 2 guns on her hips. My friend next to me reading the comment section, Black Lives Matter. Now, what could we sign or say out loud? When the last words I learned in American Sign Language was alive, alive. Both thumbs pointing at your lower abdominal, index fingers pointing up like 2 guns in the sky. And I feel like that poem also speaks to the case which is happening, the terrible and traumatic case which is happening this week. Black Lives Matter. So I think I'm just gonna read 2 more poems. The next poem I'm gonna read is, it's an erasure poem. I don't actually read it, so it's just a conceptual kind of piece in some ways. So, oops, I'm going to picture this. So this is called Deaf School by Ted Hughes, and it's an erasure of a Ted Hughes poem, and it goes on 2 pages. Sorry, it's a 30-line poem with every line redacted, and I'd come across this poem by complete chance. I wasn't looking for anything like this. I am actually a fan of Ted Hughes. I had grown up with reading his books. I am like quite typical of an English poet in that way. Hawk in the Rain was one of the first poetry collections I'd read from first to last poem. Iron Man, a book I loved of his as a kid. So I was engaged and engaging with Ted Hughes, and was just, you know, if you read this poem, you'll see the kind of assault that the poem is on deaf people. So before responding to it, I decided to do some research into what it is that made Ted Hughes write this poem. And it was actually a commission by the National Theatre in London. The director there had asked Ted Hughes to explore, quote, how people live without language. So that was the kind of hypothesis. How do people live without language? And Ted Hughes took it upon himself to go into a deaf school in London, sit in the corner and just observe deaf young people in a lesson, teaching in a classroom being students in a classroom setting. And so some of the language which he uses to describe these particular deaf children, unaware, lacking a dimension, removed from the vibration of air, alert, simple, lacking a subtle waving aura of sound and responses to sound. So there's also a whole bit in the poem which kind of uses strange kind of animal metaphors, and it's a very strange poem to read, a very upsetting poem to read. So I put it in the book and just erased it, and then I took the language of Ted Hughes and I decided to meet him poetically at his own game with using a nature-based extended metaphor and then just revising the language so it's pointed back towards him. I was in New Orleans when I wrote this poem as well. I was by the Mississippi River, so I just said, okay, let's go with the river. The river's going to speak back to Ted Hughes. I mean, I was speaking to people who lived by the Mississippi, and almost everyone had a story about someone or something emerging from the river. So that also makes it into the poem. So this is after reading Deaf School by the Mississippi River. No one wise calls the river unaware or simple pools. No one wise says it lacks a dimension. No one wise says its body is removed from the vibration of air. The river is a quiet breath taker, gargling mud. Ted is alert and simple. Ted lacked a subtle waving aura of sound and responses to sound. Ted lit through his eyes, but I, the colossal currents from the bridge, I, riverboats, ghosting a geography of fog. Mississippi means big river, named by French colonizers. The natives laughed at their arrogant maps, conquering wind and marking mist. The mouth of the river laughs. A man in a wetsuit emerges, pulls misty goggles over his head. Couldn't see a thing, he breathes heavily. My face was in darkness. No one heard him. The river drowned him out. Cool. So, yeah, the last poem I'm going to read. I hope you're all doing well today. I hope you're staying safe. I hope everyone you love is well as well, as we, as we are this far into, the times we're living through, and many of us are still alive, and that's a beautiful thing. So, this last poem I'm going to read because the question I was trying to answer in this poem was, where does language begin? So where did language begin for me? And not in that kind of poetic interior way, but in a quite, I guess, almost like a real kind of family memory way, if that makes sense. So the memory that kept coming back to me is being read to as a child, and I suppose that question is actually, now I'm thinking about that a bit more, saying it out loud, maybe the question was, where does the English language begin with me? Now that I've just thought of that, maybe that's what it was. Either way, I was read to a lot as a child by my dad, and he would read me this book, this children's picture book called Happy Birthday Moon, and it tells a story about a bear that lives out in the woods. And this one particular night, the bear stands on a high hill and looks out over the forest and the river, and he looks up at the full moon, and the bear says, "It's my birthday." And the bear's voice echoes through the valley, and he hears his echo, "It's my birthday." And the bear looks at the moon and says, "Wow, it's the moon's birthday as well." So it sets up this kind of poetic story which uses a lot of repetition between the bear having a night, celebratory night with the moon, his new friend. And I love this story. And I asked my dad to read it so often that when he would get to a page that was blank with no text on it, every night he would make up a different part of the story. So he would run his finger along the blank pages and would be speaking as if there was text there. And this was something that I think he did to amuse himself, and thinking about the kind of interesting way that kids seem to not be bored by repetition. They want to hear the same thing again and again and again, often, at least as a kid I was. So my dad would put me on his chest while he would read this poem, this book, and he would have the book out in front of him. And he had a very deep voice, and so I would feel his voice kind of vibrate while I lay in his chest. He didn't know I was deaf at the time. That was diagnosed a little bit later on. So when I think about that experience as well as a kind of accidentally inclusive, tender thing to do for a deaf child. Yeah. So this is called Happy Birthday Moon, and I'm going to dedicate it to all of you who are readers and on your own adventures in, in that question. I wonder where language began for you as well. Happy Birthday Moon. Dad reads aloud. I follow his finger across the page. Sometimes his finger moves past words tracing white space. He makes the moon say something new every night to his deaf son who slurs his speech. Sometimes his finger moves past words tracing white space. Tonight he gives the moon my name, but I can't say it. His deaf son who slurs his speech. Dad taps the page, says, try again. Tonight he gives the moon my name, but I can't say it. I say, Raymond Antrobus. He laughs. Dad taps the page, says, try again. But I like making him laugh. I say my mistake again. I say, Raymond Antrobus. He laughs, says, Raymond, there's something else. I like making him laugh. I say my mistake again. Raymond Antrobus. What else will help us? He says, Raymond, just something else. I'd like to be the moon, the bear, even the rain. Raymond Antrobus. What else will help us hear each other, really hear each other? I'd like to be the moon, the bear, even the rain. Dad makes the moon say something new every night and we hear each other, really hear each other. As Dad reads aloud, I follow his finger across the page. Thank you.
Yes, Raymond. Yes. So wonderful, so wonderful. Thank you so much for that vibrant reading. I feel really, really lucky
Yeah.
to be here tonight and to be in conversation with you, not just because you're one of my favorite living poets, but also because you are beloved deaf kin. So thank you and congratulations. It's so good to be celebrating you tonight. Thank you for that reading. I'm in the lucky position to get to like hang out and talk with you now for at least a few minutes. And one thing that I love about this collection is first of all its ambition, but also its unapologetic approach to refusing to be reduced down to a single identity. Which is rare. I see that in its balancing of family and of self, of history, of race, place of origin, of gender, and of course of deafness via mishearings, cultural lineage, sign language. And I noticed naturally that this doesn't really stop at visual representation. There's a lot of ocular stimulation in this book, and your reading is no different, right? You're an engaging reader, and we're watching you use signs and use your body. The embodiment of your reading is marked and crucial. Specifically, your text participates in this growing lineage of deaf poets writing in English, who include visual representations or visual approximations of signs on the page. I've experimented with them in We Can't Read This. Ilya Kaminsky has used them in Deaf Republic. I'm sure there are other deaf poets using them. And sometimes these images are interpreted as just that, pictures or images. And sometimes they're viewed as a more assertive kind of linguistic representation or language. I noticed that you use the signs in different ways in this text, sometimes as ordinal numbers, like the actual physical signs for 1, 2, and 3. Even in your reading this evening, you're giving us the section headings instead of the actual cardinal numbers, 1, 2, 3. And then also you're using them sometimes as semantic idea units. via non-numerical signs, like what you mentioned in your poem, Two Guns in the Sky for Daniel Harris, this sign for alive.
Mm.
I'm curious about what kind of conversation you feel you've made possible with the visual choice to include signs in your book. How do you decide when to use them and how to use them?
This is such a rich and complicated question. So I'm deeply appreciative of that. And honestly, there's no, anything I say now is just that. It's a conversation. I don't think there's anything I can say that's kind of absolute in the correct way, like to deal with language, or the way in which thinking about deaf representation, and how to do that appropriately in a book of poetry. It really was me thinking about, again, like you said, you mentioned your work, you mentioned Ilya Kaminsky. In the UK, I was looking at deaf poets, like there's a poet called Dorothy Miles, and Richard Carter. Like there's a few kind of very, maybe this is unfair to say, but quite assertive in that these are BSL poets. These are not poets who are trying to get published in the New York Times. Like this is a different world for them. And so exploring their work and then thinking where I'm coming from, I've always set out as a English language poet. I feel that that's always been my strength. And so part of, I guess, my kind of deaf poetics were about how do I honor the things that I advocate for. So like, I don't even, politically, I'm not just trying to assert, like you say, I'm not just trying to assert my deaf identity. I am also saying I'm part of an oral world. I'm part of the hearing world. I went to school in both. I went to school in a deaf school and a hearing school, both of these, which were separate spaces. And so the thing that constantly felt true about the space of poetry is that you can bring all of your identities to that space and find ways to examine them. And I feel, and people can disagree with me on this, but I feel this is one of the real special things about poetry, and for me and my practice, is the most appropriate genre for me to explore all those different sides of I guess my identity and my history, my family, and again, it's about language. So I hope that kind of sets me up to be able to say the next part of that question, which is how did I choose where to put the visual illustration of sign? So this is the interesting thing about having this book be published in the US, because like I said, ASL is a almost completely different language to BSL. So it was this discussion of, it was this almost completely. I know some similarities, or even that are different, but that's funny. The different is the same sign. Yeah. Anyway, like I was like, oh, do I need to change the signs to ASL signs now? And that was actually a question I had to sit on. And I decided not to, because again, the book is honoring my grounding of language and history, right? So it's like, well, no, it has to be BSL. Where I chose to put the signs in the book is the same kind of mentality that I used for anything, for any kind of space between a line, for any line break. The idea of white space on a page being a place of air and a place to breathe, and you can breathe your own kind of interpretations into, which is why, so one of the first signs that shows up is this one, which you get after the echo sequence, which was in BSL. I mean, this means a number of things. But one of the meanings of this sign is to continue. But it's also the name. It also happens to be the sign name of a place in Essex, which has in the UK, which has a very strong deaf community. And I happen to have visited there and seen how many different, just like, you know, learning a new language, and you see there are other connotations within your own language that you just, you know, you're constantly learning. And so for me, I wanted to throw that onto the page and make that part of the reading experience, so people can, you know, it's not said, I'm not kind of saying, I'm not translating or transcribing any of the signs that are in the book. Because again, I think that was a way to ground the book in showing, if you know, you know. It's a way to welcome and center deaf readers. So, you know, but then at the same time, you've got that other part of my brain that is, well, you do know that the English language is kind of, you know, the root of oppression for deaf people and learning sign. So how do I hold that in my head? How do I honor that? How do I acknowledge those kind of complications? And I think the only way I was able to get myself to a place to write this book was to change my thinking, which is why I kind of had to align myself with this idea of being an investigator. I am an investigator of missing sound. It's like the phrase that I chose to stick with. And I wrote that on my notebook while I was writing this book. You are an investigator of missing sound. You are not a kind of capital P polemic writer. You're not like a kind of a militant anything. You are here to complicate, and you are here to evaluate your truth in some ways. And sign language has been this part, or learning sign and going into a deaf school has been this part of my life, which also, you know, I felt guilt about coming back to it because of how ashamed I was of it when I was young. And also I want to say, but I didn't know that I was writing a kind of book that explores deafness. When I first gave in the manuscript of this book, it was twice as long. And the editor I had at the time cut the book in half and said, oh, by the way, this is your book. And at first I was like, what the hell? No. And again, I had to sit on that and come back to it. And I understood what he'd done and kind of helped me, I don't know, I guess, see, I don't want to call it a straight line, but see a coherent journey in the book. So the way in which it's ordered, which is why I spoke about Ted Hughes being one of the first poets who I read from first poem to last poem in his collections. He was a poet I found I could do that with. And that taught me, oh yeah, do this with poetry, because people talk about like dipping in and out of poetry, or they talk about like poetry anthologies. And I think something that really invigorates me is finding the collections and then the journey of the book. I hope that answers your question, Meg. I hope that's like the stuff there.
Yeah, it's wild. Everything that you're saying resonates in, 15 different ways. And I'm just thinking about all of the comments you've made about Ted Hughes, and then the fact that this is a book that has won the Ted Hughes Award.
Yeah.
It's to shape a book in that way, the way that you're describing the relationship that you had in the conversation, the journey, this text arriving in the shape that it is just wild and profound, I think, for the communities that it affects most, or the communities I anticipate it affects most. I love what you're saying about being an investigator of missing sound, because I have a question for you about erasures.
Right. Yeah, right.
The role of erasures in this collection is stimulating and troubling in the best way. You've created an erasure or a censoring, maybe, of Ted Hughes in Deaf School by Ted Hughes. I remember seeing this poem, an earlier version of it maybe, that appeared a while back. And if I'm not mistaken, it originally appeared with strike-throughs instead of these more censored blackouts. So one could read the original text beneath the sort of bold assertion of striking out Ted Hughes. It felt a little bit more like he was in the room, maybe. It was powerful, as is this version, though they obviously function differently politically, artistically, especially in this collection where the poem that follows that you read this evening is a kind of assist to this erasure. It refills or repopulates or reoccupies the space that you've made in eliminating Hughes in a way. And then there's another erasure in the book, The Mechanism of Speech, which I love. I love this poem. And the source text, if you don't yet have your copy, you can buy a copy of this book at the link in the chat. But the source text of this poem in particular is a lecture on promoting the teaching of speech to deaf folks. The lecture is by Alexander Graham Bell. And it's a poem that's a little more revealing in its process, right? It takes the text of an actual lecture of a more well-known historical figure and reduces it down to a message that you wish to convey. I'm wondering if you can talk about the process of erasure and how you made these decisions, who gets to appear and who does not, who's, in the investigation of missing sound, who actually appears in this book?
Yeah, wow. This, again, such a rich, multi-layered question. So let me see if I can break this down. I definitely want to come to the Graham Alexander Bell and just done the decision. So yeah, let me go. We start with Graham Alexander Bell and then work into Ted Hughes. The Graham Alexander Bell erasure was initially, for me, the idea was to make it a pamphlet in which I was going to take the entire speech, all the speeches that I could find, and just erase and make it an entire like epic erasure thing. And I had about 30 pages of this. And it's in your question there, like, how did I decide what to give voice to? When I had 30 pages of this erasure, I felt angry. I felt sick that this man was taking up this kind of space that much. And I just thought, I'm going to take my favorite piece of my favorite section of this entire thing and just leave it there. And just for that, because I was like, Graham Alexander Bell has enough time in our history books. He takes up enough of the conversation, often with ironically, his significance to deaf culture and his attempt to erase deaf culture, there. So I felt fine just putting in this kind of, it's only about 4 or 5 lines that I kept from the Graham Alexander Bell erasure, and with the kind of context as well. Context is very important to me. Some people had read The Perseverance and said that they didn't like having so much context, like about notes and blah, blah, blah. But for me, it was really important that I wanted to be very clear in this book about what I'm talking to and my intentions. So that's a kind of Graham Alexander Bell space. you know, there's a whole thing there about, because he's like, you know, we know he's the inventor of the telephone. The telephone was invented by accident, and you know, there's lots of stuff to talk. But there are other kind of non-fiction writers that I think delve into Alexander Graham Bell more thoroughly than I could, even if I tried. Katie Booth has a book coming out pretty soon, so which I recommend if you want to read that history. So okay. So now we're going to go to the Ted Hughes thing and the decision between the complete redaction to the strike through line, which was the first draft. You're right. So there were two things at play there. One, I was threatened with a lawsuit from the Ted Hughes estate. So if I was to publish this poem, so it was only struck through and still readable, they were either going to sue me, or they were going to make me pay to use the poem. And it was just clear that they were going to ask for a crazy amount of money. Because I think to Ted Hughes' estate saw what I was doing, and you know, people like Ted Hughes get very careful what's called legacy management, or legacy, if that's how you say the word, legacy management. So yeah. I then was like, okay, well, let's redact the whole thing. And when I looked at the redacted with nothing, and I'd already done the Graham Alexander Bell thing of making that just this segment, it just felt right. It's like, you know what? Let's put in the erasure. Let's just honor the shape that this man's autism and ableism, you know, it's just like a dictionary definition of those two things. So and I think the whole thing about like Solmaz Sharif has a line in the poem which says something like, you know, it matters what you call a thing, and how the significance of one of the most esteemed English poets, you know, writing this poem adds to the kind of charge of it. So anyway, yeah, I redacted it, but then this other thing happened. The poem took on this other life, which is I would go into deaf schools and I would share this story with deaf young people and teachers of the deaf. And I had one student put up his hand and say, oh, sir, could you just turn the book this way? I said, like that. I said, okay, great. We've got a totally different shape that this poem is making. And this student had recently had cochlear implants put in. And he said, oh, wow, that's like the screen of my doctor's, like the sound channels on the screen.
On the audiogram, yeah.
Oh, yeah, exactly, the audiogram. And it's like, oh, wow, that's, for me, that was such an important moment to happen in the classroom, and cemented my belief, my very strong belief that creativity needs to happen in our education, in schools. These kind of conversations where we creatively engage with complicated ideas is necessary, like for the development of a kind of healthy, well-rounded society, like people in society. So like, yeah, I mean, I should say that like I'm, you know, like you, Meg, I'm also an educator, and that's a very important part of my identity. It's the only thing I've been taught in. Like, I'm kind of a self-taught poet. I didn't go to school and do poetry. I went to school and I learned how to teach. I'm the thing that grounds me in my pedagogy is emotional literacy, and I could see how the very strong connection between creative writing and creative communities and emotional literacy. And then you've got that word literacy, which is such a charged word when you're thinking about deaf education and what languages and how these things are assessed. You know, the fact that I can honor all of that space and all of that truth, you know, as a poet, and have these experiences in classrooms, it's very affirming, you know. So yeah, I hope that is you know,
Yes.
investigated. Yeah. Cool.
Gosh, yes, it's already such a powerful poem, and then to put all of that behind it and to have it reinforced in that way is just, yeah, I'm so grateful that you shared all of that. I'm mindful of the time, and I wonder if you'd be willing to answer some questions from the Q&A.
Sure.
Okay. This question is from poet Johnny Checklet. He says, Raymond, you briefly mentioned that when you encounter the title poem in a text, you tend to read with a greater attention in order to hopefully catch how the various threads of the book and how they appear in said title poem. My question then is about structure. What are your considerations when you're ordering poems in your collection? What are the things that you consider when trying to craft the arc or quote journey of a book and the poems in them?
Oh, that's another rich question. Yes, I do see every book as a journey. In poetry, often a non-linear journey. It's the same is going to be, it's true of the next book I have coming out. It's kind of a non-linear journey that kind of goes inside and outside of time. I'm interested in the time as a multi-dimensional thing, and the way in which we use language moves in and out of that. And even, you know, like, you know, Meg, your question about erasure, the erasures was such a great way for me to figure out other dimensions into language, into time, into understanding, and all this kind of thing. So yeah, like poetry, look at, you know, it's again a unique space to play with. How do I order a collection? Every collection is going to be different. How I ordered this collection was actually quite a collaborative experience. So Tom Chivers, who's the editor at the independent press in the UK, called Pen in the Margins. Like I said, I sent him a book double the length of The Perseverance, and all he did was just say what he felt worked and what didn't, and just kind of removed all the stuff. And again, like, it wasn't a case of where I agreed with everything he said. He didn't agree with everything I said. There were poems that made it in that he was ambivalent about. But I liked that push and pull. I liked that challenge, that kind of someone who wasn't going to just say yes to whatever I did, and someone who seemed to be invested in making the book the most, you know, I almost want to say accessible, but I know that there's a kind of often a what's the word I'm looking for? Patronizing kind of idea of accessibility and what accessibility is. But accessibility is important to me, and and again, it's a book that I didn't just want to put in conversation with people who are kind of diehard poetry fans. Although I love you, diehard poetry fans, I am one of you. But like I say, like, I'm also trying to move into education spaces. I'm also trying to speak with teachers and teachers of the deaf, and you know, so yeah, I don't know. It was like, again, so it was a collaborative push and pull kind of thing. And there's also this weird thing that we have called intuition, where some things just feel right. And even though I couldn't intellectualize why it felt right, there were just some things that were just satisfying in some ways. And so that gut, I honored that as well. I hope that's a good answer for that.
I think so. Raymond, we only have a few minutes left, and I wonder if you want to read another poem, or if you want to tackle quickly another question.
Oh, I think let's go with another question. I think just because I think I spoke a lot. Yeah, I think let's be generous.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is from our friend Nan Jackson, and I'm so glad that Nan is asking this question because, well, I'll ask the question, I'll explain why. Nan says, thank you so much for your reading tonight. You mentioned saying your name Antrob before hearing bus after getting hearing aids. How did the soundscape of your childhood pre-hearing aids influence the sound of your poetry? And I might add on that I know that you and I both have experienced in the last handful of years, or more recently, new tech. And so I might add, how is that altering your poetics?
Oh, yeah. So again, I guess when I think about the kind of childhood soundscape, which is such a great way to put that, I think because I didn't know anything else, I didn't fully understand how much I was, quote, missing. But I definitely internalized this idea that I was broken and that something was wrong with me and that I needed to sit in classrooms with these things in my ears and also like a radio aid, a thing around my neck, and have support teachers, and then get to see how other hearing students would be looking at me and that dealing with that kind of self-consciousness, and then kind of slowly realizing that, you know, that you don't always want to stand out when you're a kid. You're trying to blend in. So I remember enthusiastically the first week I was given hearing aids and given this tech, I was actually really excited because I felt like I was about to be a cyborg. I shouldn't have seen RoboCop at that young age, but I'd stayed up late one night and I watched RoboCop. Even though I couldn't hear anything that was going on, I just knew it was a shiny metal cop with guns and action and an interesting life and a wife and kids and everything. You know, it's normal, just normal superhero thing. And so it wasn't until, I stopped wearing hearing aids because I didn't like the attention I was getting. I pretended I could hear. I grew my hair long and all of that kind of stuff. So my soundscape at that point would have been still this kind of patchy kind of thing where even within with other deaf people, even they would question that part of my identity. Like, you're not really deaf. You speak. You're oral. Why you wear hearing aids? Your signing is like baby sign. Like, you can't, so that even that, like that kind of limbo, kind of strange thing. What really hit me was leaving school, losing all my jobs because I couldn't follow instructions properly. I had loads of like very manual labor jobs, working in warehouses and like receptionist and leafleting and courier, delivering packages and stuff. And I lost all of those jobs because I was pretending I could hear. I was showing up to work, not wearing any hearing aids. And then after a bit of time, I was like, I have to accept this. I'm just going to wear one, with the idea that if I just wear one hearing aids, I will look less deaf. So, and then I went back to my school and I saw my English teacher, who I hadn't seen at this point in about 13, 14 years. And she'd seen, she remembered me. I had not had any contact with her, and she remembered me. And the first thing she said to me is, have you accepted that you're a deaf person yet? So she could see throughout my entire time at school that I wasn't embracing that and I wasn't accepting that. And that, again, was such a life-changing moment. And without that, I wouldn't have been able to kind of write a book like The Perseverance, I wouldn't have been able to develop a deaf identity, which was important to kind of articulate for myself first and foremost, and then share with, you know, readers and listeners and people in the deaf community. And there are 3 different versions of this book. So you're holding the you know, this is the published version of this book. There's an audio version of this book where I talk more between the poems. And then there's a live version of this book. I have some friends who are BSL performers and translators who know the whole book, and I perform it with them. So, you know, I think about that as well, you know, the multi-disciplinary kind of space in which we are privileged. We are privileged as deaf writers, as deaf artists as well, you know. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers the soundscape and the kind of balancing of the two. I will say very quickly, the new tech is amazing. I've got these digital hearing aids. They're Bluetooth, so they connect with my computer right now. They connect with the doorbell, not the one I'm in now, but my one in London. The doorbell, I always used to miss packages and stuff. I couldn't hear doorbells. And they connect to like speakers and stuff. Like it's a whole new kind of thing, and the sound quality is amazing, and they're tiny. That's my one thing is actually they're too small. I prefer my hearing aids being visible. That was my one feedback about these hearing aids, but they're good. They're powerful hearing aids. But they don't make me any less deaf, if you know what I mean. You know, it's still something that helps me navigate sound. And it's still difficult, and I still get angry, and I still occasionally just, you know, melt down about it. That's still part of the experience. So yeah, it's ongoing. I'm still investigating that myself.
Thank you for sharing all of that. There's so many things I want to talk with you about. We could talk for hours, but unfortunately we're out of time. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Thank you to Magic City Books. Please buy The Perseverance from your local bookstore or from Magic City Books in Tulsa. You can order online tonight. Thank you to Tin House, and thank you to Emily for providing ASL this evening. And of course, congratulations to you, Raymond. I'm so happy this book is in the world.
Thank you, Meg. This was an honor, a privilege. I was the most nervous about this reading of all the readings I've got to do online, just because, you know, I'm speaking with you. I'm speaking with, you know, deaf kin, someone a poet I admire so much. So this is an honor for me too. Thank you.
We're family. I love you. Congratulations. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.